Control is a weird game. Not because of what it's about or how it plays. No, the weirdest thing about Control is that I literally didn't know what I was getting myself into when I started playing. There's only more or less one thing I knew about this game, and that's that it's supposed to be one of the best looking games around. And that's pretty much it. I've seen this game being used as a benchmarking tool ever since it's been released, especially because it's one of the first ones that used proper ray tracing for its graphics. And that's basically all I knew. I mean, yeah, I saw that it has third-person shooting in there and a few supernatural Jedi Force powers, but I never knew in what context those were employed. And to be honest, if I were to describe a game as having third-person shooting and a few supernatural powers, you wouldn't immediately think of Control or even just any other particular game. It's like describing a game where you're part of the armed forces and expecting someone to correctly guess whether it's any particular game of the Call of Duty, Battlefield or Medal of Honor series. Especially when you're clearly talking about Arma, duh. And the fact that its graphics were the most prominent part kinda worried me going into this. Because it's usually not the best sign if a game ends up in the Crisis category, where it mostly gets remembered for its graphics tech and not anything that actually happens in the game or what players get to do in it. And since Control's most defining feature apparently is its graphics, let me start out right there. I'm one of the lucky ones that has gotten their hands on an Nvidia 30 series GPU before things got out of hand with the shortage and the scalpers driving up prices. But ironically, I don't really give that much of a shit about how good the graphics of a game are. I mean, I literally just got done playing a 17-year-old title. I care more about aesthetics than graphics, and that's a very important distinction to make. Graphics is just the technology used to render the images on screen. Aesthetics is the use of design, shapes and colors to create interesting spaces to play in and traverse. And while you definitely need some kind of graphics tech to drive the images on screen, a good aesthetic can make up immensely for out-of-date or subpar graphics tech. A handy little shorthand would be that a good aesthetic makes a game look timeless, while even the best graphics immediately date a game to exactly the point in time it was made in. And I feel that the big irony here is that even though Control boasts some gorgeous graphics, I'm not much of a fan of its aesthetic. It's true, the ray tracing implementation allows for reflections and shadows to be calculated in real time that aren't just limited to screen space. So even stuff behind the camera gets reflected in the surfaces in front of it, unlike in traditional raster rendering that only reflects stuff that got rendered in front of the camera as well. But unfortunately, much of what the game gets to render consists of very drab and lifeless looking brutalist architecture. And while I understand that a lot of shadowy government buildings have been characterized by a similar look that's supposed to evoke a very oppressive atmosphere, it doesn't make for the most interesting stuff to look at. So many environments I passed through just looked like identical office buildings, and even if they didn't, like the maintenance area, they're otherwise just uniformly grey. And for all the fancy graphics the game boasts, it still seems to have quite a few issues. I ran the game on ultra settings with the ray tracing option set to medium, because I found that even though my PC has an Nvidia RTX 3080 in it, it wasn't powerful enough to guarantee a minimum of 60 FPS at a 1440p resolution on full blast. And with those settings, I found that the game often tends to have really grainy shadows and textures. I mean, the real-time ray tracing is impressive, if you look for it. Anyone who's ever dealt with 3D software like Blender, Cinema 4D or Maya knows that ray tracing used to be a humongously time-consuming process. So to see at least some form of it implemented that renders in real time at playable frame rates is cool. But it also highlights that the hardware isn't capable enough to really deliver on those features yet. And the problem is that the differences are so small that unless you really pay attention to them, you're not going to notice. And if you're so absorbed by paying attention to the accuracy of the reflections, you're probably not having that much fun with the game. I also found it ironic that even though the ray trace reflections are a standout graphical feature in this game, none of the bathrooms you can visit have actual mirrors above the sinks. Seems like a missed opportunity. Another problem that can easily happen when you focus too much on graphical fidelity is that anything that isn't perfect sticks out even more. For example, the game features an abysmal depth of field effect that just blurs the textures of the out-of-focus model they're applied to, but not the object itself, which is just a glaring oversight. The game also suffers from horrendously slow texture loading. Ironically, the levels load really quickly, but apparently that's mostly because the game doesn't really load most of what's on the map into video memory. Either that, or my GPU's 10 GB of memory are constantly running out. Still, I've got the game installed on a pretty fast PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSD, so having having high-resolution textures take 5 seconds to load in if you want to take a closer look at something is just embarrassing. And while I'm already criticizing the graphics, although the environments look very realistic, the same can't be said for the character models. It's not just their design that often falls into the uncanny valley, it's especially the animations. Now don't get me wrong, I like a lot of the reaction animations the enemies exhibit upon getting hit, but the dialogue scenes, at least the ones that aren't full motion video, because Remedy still think video games should be more like movies, really fall apart whenever characters start speaking. For example, their teeth never touch to form any of the syllables. Once you notice it, it becomes really distracting how the mouth movements don't remotely resemble what they should look like if an actual mouth had to make those sounds. I'm not joking when I say that even Mass Effect Andromeda's lip sync was better than this.
Your parents vanished along with every other adult in Ordinary. Eventually, his power changed him. There were casualties. He wasn't fit to be the director.
Now I have to mention here that nothing I've said up to now is a deal breaker, and I usually don't really talk a lot about the graphics of any given game I'm reviewing, because I don't really feel they're that important. But if a game really puts that much stock into its graphics tech and clearly wants to be seen as something that pushes visuals to new heights, I will be there to yank its chain every time I see something that doesn't pass the smell test. So with that out of the way, let's actually talk about what Control is from a gameplay and narrative perspective. For all my ignorance over what this game is, the answer turns out to be fairly unexciting. It's a Metroidvania set in the SCP universe. I mean, not literally, but in essence it is. Control is set in the Federal Bureau of Control, a massive office complex for a shadowy government organization tasked with containing weird anomalous objects. And you get to freely explore it, find a ton of dead ends, and come back hours later with the fitting keycard or necessary power that lets you overcome that dead end. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Now I admit, it's a great idea to steal the basic concept of the SCP Foundation, because that very concept itself is brilliant. It lies at the exact crossroads between being fueled by frightful conspiranoia and offering basically limitless potential for creative supernatural horror shenanigans. And while the vast majority of the actual SCP stories aren't all that great, because let's face it, they're all written by amateur authors, and most people who try their hand at writing either aren't very good writers or aren't creative enough to come up with interesting or scary concepts, the ones that are good would actually make a perfect set of missions to embark on as a part of a video game. I personally always really liked SCP-93, the Red Sea object, so go check that out if you want to read some of the best it has to offer. Unfortunately, that isn't what Control is about. While you do get to encounter a few paranormal objects during your time in the game and read many reports about containing these objects, the actual narrative of the game is mostly about containing an invasion of some kind of interdimensional force or something that was caused by one of these objects. It's unfortunately never really made clear who or what the enemy is, since it mostly just manifests itself by taking over the people working at the Bureau who weren't equipped with the technobabble device du jour that protects them from getting infected. Oh, and it also messes up the architecture of the building as well. It's also funny how the main character Jesse refers to this invasion as the Hiss, and some of the characters act as if they've never heard that name before, implying that Jesse made it up on the spot, while others refer to them as the Hiss right from the start. Anyway, most of the enemies are just former humans. Some are a bit more creatively mutated, for the lack of a better term, so there are a few more monstrous forms you get to fight, but many of those turn out to be more annoying than anything else. Particularly the ones that gain the ability of flight, because they have a nasty habit of constantly evading your attacks. So in essence, the main threat of the game never really changes or evolves. There's no back and forth between you and an antagonist, no enemy agenda to discover. And the Metroidvania structure basically guarantees that you can never clear out an area and always have to expect a bunch of these guys to spawn in. Which after a while just gets tedious, because most of the combat encounters play out pretty much identically. You do get to learn where the Hiss eventually come from, at least in part. Though the way the narrative is written makes it painfully obvious from very early on, so you'll probably easily guess it long before the game uncovers that particular twist. If you can even call it a twist, because it doesn't actually recontextualize anything in the narrative. I guess my problem here stems mostly from the fact that the game builds so much intrigue and fascination surrounding the Federal Bureau of Control, its employees and their work, along with the many paranormal objects and situations you encounter, that a narrative this simplistic just feels underwhelming. It also doesn't help that it's incomplete, because even though you do manage to banish the invasion by closing the portal, the game still tells you that there are more enemies to fight after the credits roll, so the lockdown that the building is put under can't be lifted until then. Which never happens. The game just dumps you back into the Bureau to do the rest of the side missions and maybe engage with the terrible Fallout 4-esque repeating timed quests where some kind of emergency happens in some part of the building and you have to head over there to help out before the timer runs out. Hooray! I think it's a shame that Control can't commit to actually ending the narrative, because even though the concept isn't original, I still like a lot about the setup here. The basic gist of the narrative is this. Jesse Faden, the character you get to play as in Control, arrives at the oldest house, which is the name of the building that the game takes place in. The building itself is apparently also one of the so-called places of power. In the terminology of the game, there are places of power, objects of power, and alter world events, all of which refer to either a thing or a place where something paranormal was happened. I like that the oldest house itself is a place of power. It means that there's a lot of creative stuff you can encounter here, like an actual outdoor area contained within the building. Or the visually creative but completely ludicrous bit with the shifting maze set to a cheesy metal song. Anyway, Jessie arrives at the oldest house without any real introduction or backstory in search of her brother who got abducted by the Bureau when they were both children. So you get to walk around the lobby a bit and enter one of the corridors. And I really like the mystique of how the game starts here, especially once I noticed that the corridor I was in was passing by a conference room that had no clear entrance or exit. Or when I exited said corridor, I was back where I started and the previous section where I came through the corridor was now blocked off. That was a neat little introduction to set the mood. After Jessie makes her way up to the director's office, she finds him dead on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. After picking up the gun in question, another object of power and your primary weapon for the rest of the game, she gets chosen by an unseen board represented by an inverted black pyramid in an endless white void to be the new director, because hey, who else would it be? I like how the staff you encounter over the rest of the game all accept this without any confusion or question. It's just another day at the Bureau of messed up paranormal shit. A random civilian walking in during a Bureau-wide lockdown gets to be the new boss. Guess it must be a Tuesday. It really feeds into this otherworldly feeling of this place, though the lack of a reaction from Jessie herself kinda ruins it. In fact, she's very quick to accept pretty much everything she encounters and doesn't even flinch when she gets Jedi Force abilities or even the power of flight. I mean, even the characters in the game admit that she exhibits a fantastic range of abilities when one of the former directors could barely throw a bowling ball, and here you are tearing scenery apart like it's nothing. From there, the narrative gets fairly predictable. You get to go after the previous director's inner circle to gather the ones who weren't infected to find out where your brother is and what happened to him, and killing the others while cleaning up the place by claiming control points that serve as a respawn and fast travel point, and also sometimes undo the corruption of the architecture. In between, you also get a couple of new powers that expand your pool of abilities. Honestly, as far as the main narrative goes, there's not a lot to say here, even if I wanted to. Mostly because the game is content to leave most of the interesting mysteries it sets up hanging. For example, you can often find an insurmountable roadblock in front of you, at which point you have to visit a motel, another place of power that is somehow linked to the oldest house. And you reach said motel by pulling on a light switch cord. While you're there, you have to solve some kind of puzzle to get back out, after which the roadblock will be lifted. I like the hotel itself a lot. It has a nice atmosphere, and the locked doors with the symbols imply that it also acts as a sort of gateway between the oldest house and other places of power. Unfortunately, this is never expanded upon. You never open any other doors besides the janitor's closet for one particular mission. Speaking of the janitor, he's actually probably the most fascinating character in the entire game. He's portrayed as this weird Finnish dude who often translates Finnish idioms verbatim, so they make absolutely zero sense to anyone who isn't from Finland or has no connection to its culture. The game heavily implies that he too is not really human and possibly born out of whatever entity the board is supposed to be, since he constantly refers to you as his assistant. He's also seemingly immune to being corrupted by the hiss, and he can be encountered numerous times everywhere throughout the Bureau, so he seems to not draw any ire from all the enemies you have to fight either. Anyway, to get back to the narrative, as I mentioned, the motel is never really explained, and I think that right there is probably where Control stumbles the most. It does an excellent job setting up its mysteries, but there's zero payoff at the end for any of them. Once you encounter your brother Dylan, he predictably is also infected by the hiss, and once you close the portal at the end, he just falls into a coma. He doesn't get to talk to Jessie, and nothing about his time at the Bureau gets explained. There is a bit of backstory told through a variety of documents that state the previous director's intentions to make Dylan the new director, and he even has his eyes set on Jessie herself, as you later learn, but that's about it. I guess my problem with the narrative is that it feels content to leave pretty much everything unresolved by the end, as if it purposely tries to end on a cliffhanger to leave the door open for a sequel to explain it all. Now I have to mention here that I didn't play any of the DLC of the game, so I have no idea if anything gets wrapped up by them. One of the unlockable pieces of media hints at the fact that an expansion would be coming after all. But even if these expansions do explain more, that doesn't change the problem that the narrative that the game itself tells remains completely unresolved by it. And I really don't like stories that don't end properly. To me, Control feels like a lot of squandered potential. This is only further exemplified by how its Metroidvania portion is designed. While it is true that many places are initially locked off until you either get a superpower or gain a high enough clearance to open a door, it doesn't change the fact that the levels in Control are still fairly small and there's usually not much to be found behind those locked doors or obstacles. Whenever the main narrative sends you somewhere with a locked path, it's a pretty linear experience. And the side quests also don't do much with the format, really. There are quite a few side quests that are just checklists of places to visit to either kill specific enemies, contain or cleanse certain paranormal objects, or the quote-unquote hilarious janitorial work you get to do, like talking to plants or removing mold stuck to the walls. These side quests also feel really out of place somehow, because while the game clearly has cinematic aspirations with its sometimes weirdly paced cutscenes that leave a lot of opportunities to listen to Jesse's sometimes insufferable inner monologue, the side quests feel rather video gamey, in the sense that they're clearly just random fetch quests or checklists you have to do because hey, that's what games are supposed to have. And these checklist side quests mostly rely on hiding the stuff you have to find by only giving you a vague indication of where these enemies or objects are located. Now, I'm all for dodging the excessive signposting that many other games employ, where everything gets highlighted by a marker both on your map as well as floating in front of you that tells you precisely where your objective is. But Control goes a bit too far and just tells you the general area of where you're supposed to look with no further directions, and often hides stuff in the level's nooks and crannies. So it's content with wasting the player's time with pointless hide-and-seek gimmickry instead of actual gameplay. And the gameplay itself is hardly something I'd consider a standout feature. It's not bad, the shooting is competent, the Jedi Force powers are well done, and flying around the levels is fun. But it just feels like it's the default set of interactive elements that pretty much every modern third-person action game implements these days. You can collect or craft additional mods, both for your weapon as well as for your character, that you can swap out on the fly, and you can enhance your supernatural powers or the amount of health and energy you have with a perfunctory upgrade system. It's a little bit of a shooter here, a little bit of an RPG there, it has a little bit of horror in there, and a little bit of crafting, and it all just comes together to create an experience that I'd call perfectly middle of the road. Basic enough that pretty much anyone playing it can get something out of it, but lacking any sort of real depth. Now don't get me wrong, I don't hate Control, and I'm not saying that it's a bad game, not at all. But I also can't say that I'm particularly enamored by it. Both because of the repetitive nature of its combat, as well as the lack of a satisfying narrative resolution. To me, it just feels like it's a bit of a wasted opportunity when trying to adapt something like the SCP Foundation, which would offer more than enough fertile ground for a neat video game adventure, to then turn it into a competent but basic third-person shooter that doesn't aim to tell a compelling story with its genuinely fantastic framework as a basis.
Aina ois, das pelissä tää narrilla.